Sometimes the most profound moments in our lives arrive disguised as ordinary conversation. They slip past our defenses when we're relaxed, when our guard is down, when we think we're just making casual small talk with someone we've known for years. These moments have a way of reshaping everything we thought we understood about ourselves, about what we want, about what's possible. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The coffee shop on Maple Street had become my second home over the past 18 months. Not by choice exactly, but out of necessity. After the divorce papers were signed and the house sold, I found myself gravitating toward places where human voices created a gentle backdrop to my solitude. The baristas knew my order by heart. Medium dark roast, no sugar, splash of cream. Simple, uncomplicated. The way I preferred my life these days. It was a Tuesday morning in late September when everything changed. The autumn air carried that crisp promise of shorter days and longer nights, and the maple trees lining the street had just begun their slow transformation from green to gold. I'd claimed my usual table by the window, laptop open, pretending to work on a client proposal while actually watching pedestrians hurry past with their morning routines. The bell above the door chimed, and I glanced up from my screen out of habit. That's when I saw her. Not for the first time, but somehow differently than before. Sarah Mitchell had been coming to this same coffee shop for months, usually arriving around 9:30 with her worn leather messenger bag and reading glasses perched on her nose. She worked for the city planning department, I'd gathered from overheard phone conversations, something involving zoning permits and municipal regulations. We'd exchanged pleasantries before, the kind of polite acknowledgments that frequent customers share in small spaces. Comments about the weather, observations about how crowded the shop had become, brief nods of recognition, nothing substantial, nothing that suggested the conversation we were about to have would redirect the entire trajectory of my carefully reconstructed life. That morning, she approached my table with an unusual directness. Her auburn hair caught the morning light streaming through the window, and I noticed for the first time how it framed her face in a way that made her green eyes seem particularly bright. She wore a navy blazer over dark jeans, professional, but approachable, and carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd learned to navigate the world on her own terms. "Mind if I join you?" she asked, gesturing to the empty chair across from me. "Everywhere else seems to be taken." I looked around the shop, noting several vacant tables, but nodded anyway. "Of course. I'm Michael, by the way. Michael Harrison." "Sarah," she replied, settling into the chair and placing her coffee cup on the small round table between us. "Sarah Mitchell. I think we've been inadvertent coffee neighbors for months now." "Guilty as charged," I said, closing my laptop to give her my full attention. "You're always here reading those thick planning documents. City work?" "Municipal development," she confirmed with a slight smile. "Not nearly as exciting as it sounds. Mostly reviewing proposals for new strip malls and arguing with contractors about setback requirements." We fell into conversation easily, more easily than I'd expected. She had a way of listening that made ordinary stories seem worth telling. And her laugh came naturally, without the forced quality that had characterized so many of my interactions since the divorce. We talked about the changing neighborhood, about the new restaurant that had opened down the street, about the absurdity of the pumpkin spice season starting in August. "So what brings you to this particular coffee shop every morning?" she asked, stirring her latte thoughtfully. "Besides the exceptional customer service and gourmet atmosphere." I gestured around the modest space with its mismatched furniture and faded paint. "You mean this isn't the pinnacle of Seattle coffeehouse sophistication?" "Oh, absolutely. I'm sure it'll be featured in Travel and Leisure any day now." "Well, when you put it that way," I said, grinning. "Honestly, I moved to the apartment upstairs about a year and a half ago, after my divorce. This place became convenient, then comfortable, then essential. Now I'm not sure I remember how to function without my morning dose of overpriced caffeine and background conversations." "Divorce," she repeated, not as a question but as an acknowledgement. "That's a significant life reorganization." "That's a diplomatic way to put it," I said. 22 years of marriage ending with a mediator and a calculator. Not exactly how I'd pictured my mid-40s unfolding. "Life rarely consults our original blueprints," she observed. I went through my own version of that story about 8 years ago. Different details, same fundamental disruption of everything you thought you knew about your future. There was something in her tone that suggested more complexity than she was revealing. But I didn't press. We'd moved beyond small talk, but we weren't quite at the stage of sharing deeply personal histories. Not yet. "Do you have kids?" I asked. "2," she said, her expression softening. "Emma's 26 now, lives in Portland working for an environmental nonprofit. And Jake just turned 24. He's finishing medical school at University of Washington. Both of them handled the divorce better than their father and I did, honestly. Kids are resilient in ways that adults forget how to be." "That's a relief to hear," I said. "My ex-wife and I never had children. It was always, someday. And then, suddenly someday had passed, and we were looking at 45 with completely different ideas about what we wanted from the rest of our lives." "And what do you want?" she asked. "From the rest of your life, I mean." It was a simple question that caught me completely off guard. Not because I hadn't thought about it, but because I'd been thinking about it constantly for 18 months and still didn't have a clear answer. The honest response was that I wanted to feel like myself again, to rediscover the person I'd been before 2 decades of compromise and accommodation had worn away my edges. But that seemed too complex for a Tuesday morning conversation with someone I barely knew. "I'm still figuring that out," I said finally. "For now, I'm focused on work, on establishing some new routines, on learning how to be alone without being lonely. What about you?" "Stability," she said without hesitation. "My kids are both launched and independent. My career is solid. I have a house I love, friends I trust, hobbies that engage me. I've built a life that works, and I'm not particularly interested in disrupting it for the sake of change." "That sounds remarkably healthy and well-adjusted," I said. "Does it?" She laughed. "Sometimes I wonder if it's healthy or just careful. There's a difference." We talked for another 40 minutes, the conversation meandering through topics with the kind of natural flow that suggested genuine compatibility. She mentioned her love of hiking in the Cascade Mountains, her weekend pottery classes, her volunteer work at the local animal shelter. I found myself sharing stories about my consulting business, about learning to cook for one person, about the surprising freedom of making decisions without having to negotiate with another person. "I should probably get to work," she said eventually, glancing at her phone. "City planning waits for no one, and I have a particularly contentious zoning meeting this afternoon." "Of course," I said, though I realized I didn't want the conversation to end. "This was nice. Really nice." "It was," she agreed, gathering her things. "Maybe we'll run into each other again tomorrow morning." "I'll be here," I said. Same time, same table, same existential crisis disguised as productivity. She laughed, a genuine sound that stayed with me long after she'd left the coffee shop. I sat there for another hour, ostensibly working but actually replaying the conversation, trying to understand why it had felt significant. Sarah was attractive, certainly, but it was more than that. She had a quality of presence that was simultaneously calming and energizing, as if she'd figured out how to be completely comfortable in her own skin. Over the following weeks, our morning encounters became a pattern, not planned exactly, but anticipated. We'd claim adjacent tables or share the large communal table when the shop was busy, and our conversations gradually deepened. She told me about her work mediating disputes between developers and neighborhood groups, about the satisfaction she found in helping people find common ground in seemingly impossible situations. I shared stories from my consulting practice, which focused on helping small businesses optimize their operations. 25 years in corporate management had taught me how organizations could become more efficient, and the divorce had given me the motivation to strike out on my own. The work was challenging and varied, taking me to family restaurants struggling with inventory management, retail stores trying to streamline their customer service, nonprofit organizations attempting to maximize their impact with limited resources. "You're a problem solver," she observed one morning, as I described a particularly complex project involving a chain of auto repair shops. "I suppose I am," I said, "though I'm better at solving other people's problems than my own." "Aren't we all?" she replied. "It's easier to see solutions when you're not emotionally invested in the outcome." These conversations became the highlight of my days. Sarah had a way of asking questions that made me think more deeply about my own experiences, and she listened with an attention that made even mundane stories feel worth telling. I found myself looking forward to these morning meetings with an anticipation that surprised me. One particularly gray October morning, she arrived at the coffee shop looking unusually subdued. Her usual energy seemed muted, and she stirred her coffee absently while staring out the window at the drizzle. "Everything okay?" I asked. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Just one of those days," she said with a forced smile. "My ex-husband called last night. He's getting remarried next month. How do you feel about that?" "Honestly, relieved," she said, then paused as if surprised by her own answer. 8 years ago, news like that would have devastated me. Now it just feels like the final period at the end of a very long sentence. He's 49, she's 31, and they're planning to have children together. That must be complicated to process. "The strange thing is how uncomplicated it feels," she said. "I genuinely hope he's happy. We weren't right for each other, and it took us far too long to admit it. But hearing about his new life made me think about my own life, about whether I've become too comfortable with solitude. Is that necessarily a bad thing? I don't know," she said. "Sometimes I think I've confused independence with isolation. They're not the same thing, but they can look similar from the outside." I wanted to say something meaningful, something that would acknowledge the complexity of what she was sharing without offering empty reassurance. But before I could formulate a response, she shifted the conversation to lighter topics. And the moment passed. That afternoon, as I worked from my apartment, I found myself thinking about Sarah's words. The distinction between independence and isolation resonated more deeply than I'd expected. My own post-divorce life had been carefully constructed around autonomy, around the relief of making decisions without consultation or compromise. But was that independence, or had I simply gotten comfortable with a different kind of loneliness? The next morning, Sarah seemed more like herself, arriving with her usual energy and a story about a particularly absurd argument she'd mediated between a coffee shop owner and the Historical Preservation Society. We laughed about the bureaucratic absurdities of municipal governance, and the previous day's more serious conversation felt like it belonged to a different time. But something had shifted. Our exchanges carried a subtle undercurrent of deeper possibility, as if we were both aware that we were edging toward territory that went beyond casual friendship. Neither of us acknowledged this directly, but it informed the way we looked at each other, the way we leaned slightly closer when we talked, the way our conversations seemed to carry more weight than their content strictly warranted. It was during one of these charged but unspoken moments that I made the comment that would change everything. We'd been discussing age and career transitions, sparked by a news article about a 70-year-old woman who had just completed law school. "It's inspiring," Sarah said, "but also daunting. The idea of starting something completely new at that stage of life." "Age is such a strange construct," I replied. "We let it define what's possible for us in ways that are completely arbitrary." "Says the man who's probably never been asked if he's too old for anything," she said with gentle teasing. "Fair point," I admitted. "Though I've definitely started feeling the weight of certain societal expectations, the pressure to have everything figured out by now, to be settled in a way that feels permanent." "What would you do differently if age weren't a factor?" she asked. I considered the question seriously, struck by how rarely I allowed myself to think beyond the constraints of what seemed age-appropriate. "I'd probably be more willing to take risks," I said finally. "More open to possibilities that don't fit conventional timelines." "Like what?" "Like falling in love again," I said, surprising myself with honesty. "Like believing that starting over at 46 could be an adventure instead of a consolation prize." Sarah was quiet for a moment, her green eyes studying my face with an intensity that made me suddenly self-conscious about what I'd revealed. "You know," I continued, trying to lighten the mood with humor, "if you were 35, I'd probably propose to you right here on the spot." The words left my mouth before I fully realized what I was saying. It was meant as a joke, a way to acknowledge the connection we'd developed while maintaining the safe distance of impossibility. But as soon as I spoke, I realized the comment revealed more truth than I'd intended. Sarah's expression shifted, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth, but her eyes held something more serious, more considering. "I'm 48, she said quietly, her voice carrying a note of challenge or invitation, I couldn't tell which. "Is that too old?" The question hung between us like a bridge neither of us had planned to build but suddenly found ourselves standing on. The coffee shop noise faded into background, and I became hyper-aware of everything. The way the morning light caught the silver threads in her hair, the slight tremor in her hands as she held her coffee cup, the way she was looking at me as if my answer might matter more than either of us had expected. This was the moment. The unexpected moment that arrives disguised as casual conversation. The moment that would require me to decide whether I was ready to step beyond the safe boundaries of my carefully reconstructed life. Sarah's question wasn't really about age, and we both knew it. It was about courage, about possibility, about whether two people who had built stable, independent lives could risk the beautiful uncertainty of building something together. The silence stretched between us for what felt like an eternity but was probably only 5 seconds. Sarah's question echoed in my mind. "I'm 48. Is that too old?" The weight of her words settled over me like a warm blanket on a cold morning, simultaneously comforting and terrifying. I looked into her eyes and saw something I hadn't expected to see there. Vulnerability mixed with defiance, as if she were daring me to prove that age mattered more than connection. The careful walls we'd both built around our post-divorce lives suddenly felt transparent. Inadequate protection against whatever was happening between us. "No," I said, my voice quieter than I'd intended but steadier than I felt. 48 isn't too old, not for anything that matters. The relief that washed over her face was subtle but unmistakable, like watching tension leave someone's shoulders after they've been carrying a heavy load. She leaned back in her chair, and for the first time since I'd known her, Sarah looked genuinely surprised by something. "That's not what I expected you to say," she admitted. "What did you expect?" A polite deflection. Maybe a comment about how age is just a number, followed by a quick change of subject. Most people aren't comfortable with direct questions about things that matter. "I'm not most people," I said, then immediately felt foolish for the grandiose statement. I mean, I used to be. Most people, that is. Safe responses, conventional thinking, avoiding anything that might complicate the status quo. But sitting here with you, I realize I don't want to be that person anymore. Sarah studied my face with the careful attention of someone trying to read a map to unfamiliar territory. "What are you saying, Michael?" The question forced me to examine my own intentions, to move beyond the spontaneous honesty of the moment, and consider what I actually wanted. The coffee shop continued its normal rhythm around us, baristas calling out orders, the espresso machine hissing, conversations blending into a comfortable ambient hum. But our table felt like an island of heightened awareness. "I'm saying that I've spent the last 18 months learning how to be alone," I began, choosing my words carefully. "I've gotten good at it, maybe too good. But talking with you these past few weeks has reminded me that being comfortable with solitude and being afraid of connection are two different things." "And you think you've been afraid of connection?" "I think I've been afraid of the wrong kind of connection," I clarified. "The kind that requires you to compromise yourself into someone you don't recognize. But this," I gestured between us, "whatever this is, it doesn't feel like compromise. It feels like a possibility." Sarah's fingers traced the rim of her coffee cup, a nervous gesture that humanized her in a way that made my chest tighten. "Possibility," she repeated. "That's a dangerous word for two people who've worked very hard to build predictable lives. Maybe predictable is overrated. Or maybe we've both forgotten why predictable felt necessary in the first place." She was right, of course. The divorce had taught me the value of emotional stability, of waking up each morning knowing exactly what to expect from the day ahead. No arguments over breakfast. No passive-aggressive comments about dishes left in the sink. No careful navigation around someone else's moods and expectations. Just the calm simplicity of decisions made without consultation or compromise. But sitting across from Sarah, I realized that what I'd labeled as stability might have been something closer to emotional hibernation. Safe, yes, but also static. Comfortable in the way that staying in bed all day is comfortable. Pleasant in the moment, but ultimately unfulfilling. "Can I ask you something?" I said. At this point, I think we're past polite boundaries. she replied with a smile that didn't quite hide her nervousness. When you asked if 48 was too old, what were you really asking? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her eyes focused on something beyond my shoulder. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of thoughts she'd clearly been wrestling with for more than just this conversation. I was asking if I've waited too long, she said. If I've been so focused on building a life that works that I've forgotten to build a life that matters. My kids are grown, my career is established, my house is paid off. I've checked all the boxes for what constitutes a successful middle-aged woman. But success and fulfillment aren't always the same thing. What would fulfillment look like for you? Honestly, I'm not entirely sure anymore. For so long, my identity was wrapped up in being a wife and mother. Then, after the divorce, it was about proving I could be independent, self-sufficient, complete, on my own. Both phases felt necessary, but neither felt entirely authentic. And now I'm wondering if authenticity might require being vulnerable again. Allowing someone else to matter enough that they could hurt me if they chose to. The admission hung between us like a confession, intimate and brave and slightly terrifying. I understood exactly what she meant because I'd been wrestling with the same realization. The protective mechanisms that had helped me survive the dissolution of my marriage had also insulated me from the possibility of genuine connection. That's what scares me about this conversation, I said. Not your age, not the practical complications of two middle-aged people figuring out how to date again. What scares me is how much I want to say yes to whatever question you're really asking. What question do you think I'm asking? Whether we're brave enough to find out what this could become. Sarah reached across the table and placed her hand over mine, the first intentional physical contact we'd shared beyond polite handshakes. Her skin was warm, slightly calloused from her weekend pottery classes, and the simple touch sent an unexpected jolt of electricity up my arm. I haven't felt this nervous about anything in years, she said. It's terrifying and exhilarating and completely impractical. Impractical how? Well, for starters, I have no idea how to date a 48-year-old woman. My last first kiss was in 1994. My last relationship began when Monica and Ross were will they, won't they, and ended when they were definitely won't they. The world has changed, technology has changed, expectations have changed. I'm not sure I know the rules anymore. Maybe the rules don't matter as much as we think they do, I suggested. Maybe the important stuff, honesty, respect, genuine affection, those things don't have expiration dates. Or maybe I'm overthinking this entire conversation and you were just making a casual comment about hypothetical proposals to hypothetical 35-year-olds. Was I? I asked, meeting her eyes directly. Does this feel casual to you? No, she admitted. It feels like standing at the edge of a cliff, trying to decide whether the water below is deep enough to make jumping worthwhile. And what's your assessment? About the water depth, I mean. Sarah laughed, a sound that carried both nervousness and delight. I think we're about to find out. The barista called out someone's order, a triple-shot caramel macchiato with oat milk, and the mundane interruption reminded us that we were having this life-altering conversation in a public space filled with people going about their ordinary Tuesday morning routines. The juxtaposition felt surreal, as if we'd stumbled into a parallel universe where profound personal revelations happened over cooling coffee and background jazz. So what happens now? I asked. I have absolutely no idea, Sarah said. My experience with relationship progression is limited to a courtship that began in college and ended in divorce court. I'm not sure I remember how this works. Maybe it works however we want it to work, I suggested. Maybe the advantage of being our age is that we get to write our own rules. That's either very wise or completely naive. Probably both. Sarah glanced at her phone and made a small sound of surprise. I'm supposed to be at work in 20 minutes, and I still need to stop by my house to pick up some files. Of course, I said, trying to keep the disappointment out of my voice. Real life intrudes. Not intrudes, she corrected, standing and gathering her things. Real life continues, but maybe... She paused, seeming to gather courage for whatever she was about to say. Maybe you'd like to have dinner with me sometime. Somewhere that doesn't serve coffee in paper cups. I would like that very much, I said, standing as well. When? Friday night? 7 o'clock? There's a new Italian place on Pine Street that's supposed to be excellent. Friday night, 7 o'clock, Italian food, I repeated, as if committing the details to memory would make them more real. Should I pick you up or… Let's meet there, she said quickly, then seemed to reconsider. Actually, no. Yes, pick me up. If we're doing this, let's do it properly. She pulled a business card from her wallet and wrote her home address on the back in careful script. Her handwriting was neat, precise, the letters slightly slanted as, if leaning forward with anticipation. 1247 Elm Street, I read. The blue house with the ridiculous rose garden? You know my house? I run past it sometimes on Saturday mornings. I always wondered who had the patience to maintain those flower beds. That would be me and my complete inability to throw away plants that might still have life in them, she said. Fair warning, my garden is prettier than my house. I doubt that. Sarah smiled, an expression that seemed to light up her entire face. We'll see. Friday at 7 then. Don't be late. I have a tendency to overthink things when I have too much time to prepare. I'll be there at 6:58. Perfect. She leaned forward slightly, as if considering whether to hug me goodbye, then seemed to think better of it and extended her hand instead. I took it, holding the handshake a moment longer than strictly necessary, feeling the slight tremor in her fingers that matched the rapid beating of my own heart. Michael? She said as she turned to leave. Yeah? Thank you. For answering honestly. For not making this weird or complicated. Thank you for asking the question in the first place. I almost didn't. I spent the entire walk here this morning trying to talk myself out of it. What changed your mind? You did, she said simply. The way you've listened to me these past few weeks, the way you've shared your own stories without trying to fix mine. You made me think that maybe honesty was worth the risk. After she left, I sat alone at our table for another hour, ostensibly working on my laptop but actually replaying every moment of our conversation. The coffee shop gradually emptied as the morning rush transitioned to the lunchtime crowd, and I found myself studying the space where Sarah had been sitting, trying to process the magnitude of what had just occurred. 3 hours ago, I'd been a recently divorced consultant who'd found a comfortable routine built around solitude and professional focus. Now I was a man with dinner plans and butterflies in his stomach, wondering what to wear to impress a 48-year-old city planner with beautiful eyes and a ridiculously well-maintained garden. The shift felt both dramatic and completely natural, as if I'd been waiting for exactly this conversation without realizing it. Sarah's question about age had forced me to examine my own assumptions about what was possible at this stage of life, about whether the best years for romance and partnership were necessarily behind us. I thought about my ex-wife, about the way our relationship had gradually calcified into routine and obligation. We'd met in our early 20s, married at 25, and spent the next 2 decades trying to fit ourselves into roles that had felt authentic at the beginning, but became increasingly constricting as we evolved into different people. The divorce had been painful, but not surprising, the inevitable conclusion to years of growing apart rather than growing together. We'd parted with mutual respect, but little regret, both of us recognizing that we'd simply outgrown the people we'd been when we first fell in love. But Sarah was different. Sarah was a complete person who'd already done the work of figuring out who she was beyond her marriage, beyond her children, beyond the societal expectations that had shaped her earlier choices. She wasn't looking for someone to complete her. She was considering whether someone might complement the life she'd already built. That distinction felt crucial. The difference between need and want, between desperation and choice, between settling for companionship and actively choosing partnership. I closed my laptop and walked home through the crisp autumn afternoon, past the elementary school where children were playing in the yard, past the bookstore where an elderly couple was browsing the sidewalk display, past the park where a group of teenagers was engaged in what appeared to be a very serious game of frisbee. Normal life continuing around me, but everything felt different now. The colors seemed more vivid, the sounds more distinct, as if I'd been living with a filter over my senses that had suddenly been removed. At home, I found myself standing in front of my closet, mentally cataloging my dinner-appropriate attire. When was the last time I'd worried about what to wear on a date? The realization that I was already thinking of Friday night as a date rather than just dinner between friends, sent another wave of nervous excitement through my chest. I had 4 days to prepare for an evening that might change everything, or might simply be a pleasant meal between two mature adults who'd discovered they enjoyed each other's company. Either outcome felt significant, weighted with possibility and risk in equal measure. The afternoon stretched ahead of me, filled with client calls and project deadlines, the ordinary mechanics of my professional life. But underneath it all was the steady hum of anticipation, the knowledge that Friday at 7 o'clock, I would be standing on Sarah Mitchell's front porch with flowers or wine or whatever. 46-year-old men brought to dinner with 48-year-old women who might be too old for everything except the things that mattered most. Friday arrived with unseasonable warmth for late October, as if the universe had decided to cooperate with my newfound optimism. I spent the morning attempting to focus on work, reviewing quarterly reports for a client in Tacoma, but my concentration kept drifting to the evening ahead. By noon, I'd abandoned any pretense of productivity and decided to channel my nervous energy into something useful. The florist on 4th Avenue knew me as the guy who sent arrangements to clients and occasionally bought flowers for his mother's birthday. Today, I stood before their display case like a tourist in a foreign country, completely overwhelmed by options I'd never considered before. "Something specific in mind?" asked Elena, the shop owner, a woman in her 60s whose accent carried traces of her childhood in Bulgaria. "Dinner flowers," I said, then immediately felt ridiculous. "I mean, flowers for someone I'm taking to dinner. Someone I've never taken to dinner before." Elena's knowing smile suggested she'd navigated this territory many times. "First date flowers are important. Not too romantic, that's presumptuous. Not too casual, that's dismissive. Something that says, I'm interested but not overwhelming?" "Exactly," I said, grateful for her expertise. "She's 48, works for the city, grows her own roses." "Ah, a gardener. That changes everything. She'll appreciate quality over flashiness. What about these?" She indicated a small bouquet of white lilies mixed with eucalyptus and baby's breath. Elegant without being ostentatious. The arrangement had a natural quality that reminded me of Sarah's unpretentious confidence. "Perfect," I said, then second-guessed, myself. Or maybe too perfect. I don't want to look like I'm trying too hard. "My friend," Elena said with maternal patience, "if you're this worried about the flowers, she's already more important than you're admitting to yourself." Her observation hit closer to home than I was comfortable acknowledging. The truth was that somewhere between Tuesday's coffee conversation and Friday afternoon's flower selection, this dinner had evolved in my mind from an experiment in middle-aged dating to something that felt significantly more consequential. I arrived at 1247 Elm Street at exactly 6:58, as promised. Sarah's house was indeed blue, a soft cornflower shade that complemented rather than competed with the explosion of colors in her front garden. Even in late autumn, her yard displayed an impressive array of late-blooming perennials: burgundy mums, purple asters, and, yes, several rose bushes still producing blooms despite the season. The house itself was a 1920s craftsman bungalow with a wide front porch and original leaded glass windows. Wind chimes hung from the porch eaves, creating soft music in the evening breeze. Everything about the place suggested someone who paid attention to details, who understood that beauty lived in the accumulation of small, thoughtful choices. I knocked rather than using the doorbell, partly out of politeness and partly because I needed the extra few seconds to collect myself. Through the front window, I could see warm light spilling from what appeared to be the living room, and I caught a glimpse of built-in bookshelves lined with what looked like hundreds of volumes. When Sarah opened the door, my careful preparation for this moment proved completely inadequate. She wore a deep green dress that brought out her eyes, with a lightweight cardigan that suggested someone who planned for temperature changes. Her hair was down rather than in its usual ponytail, framing her face in waves that caught the porch light. She'd applied makeup with a subtle hand, enough to enhance her natural features without masking them. "Hi," she said, and her smile carried the same nervous energy I was feeling. "Hi yourself," I managed, extending the flowers. "Elena at the flower shop promised these wouldn't be too presumptuous." "Elena has good judgment," Sarah said, accepting the bouquet. "And excellent taste. These are beautiful, Michael. Thank you." "You," Looks stunning, I said, meaning it completely. You clean up pretty well yourself, she replied, giving my dark slacks and button-down shirt an approving glance. Come in for a minute while I put these in water. I promise not to subject you to the full house tour on our first date. Her use of the phrase first date sent a small thrill through me, an acknowledgement that we were both thinking beyond tonight. The interior of her house matched the thoughtful exterior. Hardwood floors gleamed under warm lighting, and the living room featured a mix of vintage and contemporary furniture that somehow worked perfectly together. Books were everywhere, not just on the built-in shelves but stacked on side tables, tucked into corners, marking the presence of someone who read, voraciously and without apology. Your home is beautiful, I said, meaning it. It feels like you. That's either a compliment or a very diplomatic way of saying I'm slightly chaotic but generally well-intentioned, she called from the kitchen, where I could hear her arranging the flowers. Definitely a compliment. It feels lived in, authentic, like someone actually enjoys being here. She emerged from the kitchen carrying the flowers in a simple glass vase, which she placed on the dining room table. I do enjoy being here. It took me 3 years after the divorce to make this place feel like mine, rather than like a house where my family used to live. But now it's exactly what I want. Space for my books, room for my hobbies, a garden that reflects my completely irrational affection for plants that probably won't survive the winter. The roses look like they're thriving. Those are the survivors, she said with a laugh. You should see my compost pile. It's a graveyard of my horticultural ambitions. We drove to Antonello's in my car, a 5-year-old Honda that I'd chosen for reliability rather than style. Sarah navigated the conversation during the short drive, asking about my consulting work in a way that suggested genuine interest rather than polite small talk. What's the most challenging business problem you've ever solved? She asked as we waited at a red light. That's easy, I said. A family restaurant in Spokane that was hemorrhaging money. 3rd-generation business, beloved in the community. But they were pricing their menu based on what their grandfather charged in 1987. Inflation denial? More like emotional pricing. They couldn't bear to charge what the food was actually worth because they'd always seen themselves as the affordable option for working families. Noble intention, unsustainable business model. How did you fix it? We restructured their entire approach, kept some traditional items at the old prices as loss leaders, introduced a separate artisan menu with higher quality ingredients and appropriate pricing, and created package deals that gave families affordable options while ensuring the restaurant actually made money. Did it work? They're opening a 2nd location next year, I said with satisfaction. Sometimes the solution isn't changing what you do. It's finding a way to do what you love sustainably. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. That's not unlike municipal planning, actually. Trying to balance community needs with financial reality. Honoring what people value about their neighborhood while allowing for necessary growth and change. Antonello's occupied the ground floor of a converted Victorian house, with exposed brick walls and tables lit by candlelight. The hostess seated us at a corner table that provided both intimacy and a view of the bustling open kitchen. The restaurant had the kind of authentic atmosphere that couldn't be manufactured, the result of good food, attentive service, and years of satisfied customers. This is lovely, Sarah said, settling into her chair. How did you know about this place? Client recommendation, I admitted. The owner of a catering company I worked with last year. She said it was the kind of place she'd want someone to take her if they were trying to impress her without trying too hard. Sounds like she understood the assignment, Sarah said with amusement. And it sounds like you were planning to impress me, guilty as charged. Though I'm discovering that impressing you might be more about honesty than atmosphere. Our server appeared, a young man named David who clearly took pride in his knowledge of the menu and wine list. Sarah ordered the mushroom risotto after asking detailed questions about the preparation, while I chose the osso buco based entirely on David's enthusiastic recommendation. Wine? I asked Sarah. I'd love a glass of red, she said. Something Italian to match the setting. David suggested a Chianti Classico from a small vineyard in Tuscany, describing its flavor profile with the passion of someone who'd clearly tasted it himself. We agreed to share a bottle, and I felt a small surge of domestic pleasure at making a decision together, even one as simple as wine selection. Can I confess something? Sarah said after David had left with our order. I hope you will. I changed clothes 3 times before you arrived. I haven't felt this nervous about an evening in years, and I'm not entirely sure whether that's wonderful or terrifying. Both? I suggested. I bought flowers from Elena after seeking extensive consultation about first date flower protocol. Apparently, we're both out of practice. Maybe that's not a bad thing, she said. Maybe being out of practice means we won't take any of this for granted. The wine arrived, and David performed the ritual of tasting and approval with theatrical precision. The Chianti was excellent, rich without being heavy, complex enough to reward attention but approachable enough for conversation. To new experiences, I said, raising my glass. To questions that are scarier than their answers, Sarah replied, touching her glass to mine. We talked through dinner with the kind of easy flow that made me forget we were technically still getting to know each other. Sarah told me about her children, Emma's work with environmental restoration projects in Oregon, Jake's decision to specialize in emergency medicine despite her maternal concerns about the stress and long hours. They're both so much braver than I was at their age, she said, twirling risotto around her fork. Emma moved across the country with nothing but a backpack and a job offer from a nonprofit that pays barely enough to cover rent. Jake chose one of the most demanding medical specialties because he wants to help people in crisis. I spent my 20s and 30s playing it safe, making sensible choices. Sensible choices aren't necessarily wrong choices, I pointed out. You raise 2 confident, compassionate adults who feel free to take risks because they had a stable foundation. That's not insignificant. You're kind to say that. But I wonder sometimes if I modeled caution when I should have modeled courage. What would courage have looked like? I don't know, she said thoughtfully. Maybe traveling more when they were young, even if it meant stretching the budget. Maybe pursuing creative interests instead of always prioritizing practical concerns. Maybe ending my marriage sooner instead of spending years trying to fix something that wasn't broken, just incompatible. I shared my own stories of paths not taken, including the job offer I'd received 15 years ago to help launch a nonprofit focused on microfinance in developing countries. The salary would have been half what I was making in corporate consulting. The travel extensive, the work uncertain. Why didn't you take it? Sarah asked. Fear, mostly. Fear of financial instability. Fear of being away from home so much. Fear of failing at something that mattered more than quarterly profit margins. Do you regret it? I regret not seriously considering it. I regret making the decision based on fear rather than careful evaluation of what I actually wanted from my life. And what did you want? At the time, security, predictability, the illusion that playing it safe would guarantee happiness. And now? Now I think happiness might require a willingness to be occasionally uncomfortable. Sarah smiled, an expression that transformed her entire face. Like having dinner with someone you've only known for a few weeks and discovering you want to know them for years. Exactly like that, I said, feeling my heart rate accelerate at her casual reference to years of knowing each other. We lingered over dessert, tiramisu that we shared, trading bites and opinions about the perfect ratio of coffee to mascarpone. The restaurant gradually emptied around us, but neither of us seemed eager to end the evening. I should probably get you home, I said eventually, glancing at my watch. It's past 10, and we both have work tomorrow. Probably, she agreed, but made no move to gather her things, though I'm discovering that I'm reluctant for this evening to end. We could extend it slightly, I suggested. Coffee somewhere? A walk if the weather holds? My house has a porch swing and a view of the stars, she offered. If you're interested in seeing whether my garden looks as good by moonlight. I'm very interested, I said, probably too quickly. The drive back to Elm Street passed in comfortable conversation about the dinner, the restaurant, our shared appreciation for David's enthusiastic service. But underneath the casual chat was a current of anticipation, an awareness that we were choosing to extend the evening beyond its natural conclusion. Sarah's porch swing proved to be a wide wooden affair with cushions that had been carefully chosen to coordinate with her garden's color scheme. We settled onto it with the careful distance of people still learning each other's boundaries, though the swing's design encouraged a kind of intimate proximity that felt both natural and charged with possibility. Look up, Sarah said, pointing toward the sky. The city lights couldn't completely obscure the stars, and the moon was nearly full, casting everything in silver relief. Her garden, which had been impressive in daylight, was transformed by darkness into something almost magical. Shapes and shadows that suggested mystery and depth beyond what was visible. "This is beautiful," I said. "I can see why you chose this house." "Actually, the house chose me," she said. "I wasn't looking for anything this big or this far from downtown. But I drove by one afternoon while I was exploring neighborhoods, and there was a for sale sign in the yard. I called the realtor from my car and asked to see it immediately." Love at first sight? Something like that. It felt like a possibility. Like a place where I could figure out who I was supposed to be in this next chapter of my life. We swayed gently in the swing, the chains creaking softly in rhythm with our movement. The evening air carried the scent of her late-blooming roses, mixed with the crisp promise of approaching winter. "Can I ask you something that might be too personal?" I said. "At this point, I think we're past worrying about being too personal. When you asked me if 48 was too old, what were you afraid I'd say?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her head tilted back against the swing's cushion, her eyes focused on something beyond the visible horizon. "I was afraid you'd say yes, obviously," she said finally. "But I was more afraid you'd say no, but not mean it. That you'd give the socially acceptable answer while thinking that 48 was indeed too old for romance, for passion, for the kind of relationship that makes you feel young and alive and slightly ridiculous. And now? Now I think maybe age is just one more thing we let define us when it doesn't have to." Tonight felt... She paused, searching for the right words. Tonight felt like discovery. Like meeting someone whose company I genuinely enjoy, whose stories I want to hear, whose thoughts I want to understand better. "I feel the same way," I said. "Exactly the same way." We sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, the kind of quiet that felt full rather than empty. Occasionally, Sarah would point out a constellation or mention a change she was planning for her spring garden. I found myself studying her profile in the moonlight, memorizing the curve of her cheek, the way her hair caught the silver light. "I should go," I said eventually, though every instinct argued against leaving. "Should you?" she asked. And there was something in her tone that made me look at her more carefully. "Do you not want me to?" "I want whatever feels right to both of us," she said. "But if you're leaving because you think you should rather than because you want to, that seems like the kind of decision we might regret." "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that we're both adults who can make decisions based on what we actually want, rather than what we think is expected of us." The invitation was clear, and the desire to accept it was overwhelming. But something held me back. Not propriety exactly, but a sense that rushing toward physical intimacy might shortchange the emotional connection we were building. "Sarah," I said carefully, "I want to stay. I want that more than I've wanted anything in a very long time. But I also want to do this right, whatever right means for us." She turned to face me fully, her green eyes serious in the moonlight. "What does right look like to you? Honest? Intentional? Built on more than just physical attraction? Though there's definitely that too." "For me too," she said softly. "Both. The attraction and the wanting to build something substantial. So maybe we take our time? Maybe we see where this goes without rushing toward any particular destination?" "That sounds very mature and sensible," she said with a smile that suggested she was both pleased and slightly disappointed by my restraint. "Though I should mention," I added, leaning slightly closer, "that mature and sensible doesn't mean I don't want to kiss you goodnight." "I was hoping you'd mention that," she said. The kiss was soft, tentative at first, then deeper as we both discovered that whatever chemistry we'd felt in conversation translated perfectly to physical connection. Sarah's lips were warm, and she tasted faintly of wine and tiramisu. When we separated, we stayed close enough that I could feel her breath on my face. 48 definitely isn't too old," I said against her ear. "Good to know," she whispered back. "Neither is 46. I walked to my car with the kind of elated energy that reminded me why people wrote songs about falling in love. The evening had exceeded every expectation I'd allowed myself to have, and I already knew I wanted to see Sarah again as soon as possible. As I drove home through the quiet Seattle streets, I realized that something fundamental had shifted. This wasn't just about dating again or ending my post-divorce isolation. This was about the possibility of partnership with someone who challenged me to be more honest, more present, more willing to risk comfort for the sake of genuine connection. At 46, I was discovering that the best chapters of my life might still be unwritten. The weeks following our first date unfolded with the kind of deliberate slowness that only people who've learned patience through experience can appreciate. Sarah and I fell into a rhythm that felt both natural and carefully constructed. Dinner twice a week, Saturday morning hikes in the Cascades when weather permitted, occasional spontaneous coffee meetings that stretched into afternoon conversations. By November, the Pacific Northwest had settled into its characteristic gray drizzle, transforming Seattle into a watercolor painting of muted tones and soft edges. Rather than dampening our emerging relationship, the weather seemed to encourage a kind of intimate cocoon building. We spent evenings at Sarah's house, cooking together while rain drummed against her kitchen windows, or at my apartment, reading, in companionable silence while jazz played softly in the background. It was during one of these quiet November evenings that Sarah shared the story that helped me understand not just who she was, but why she'd built her life with such careful attention to independence and emotional security. We were preparing dinner together in her kitchen, a simple pasta dish with vegetables from her garden that she'd preserved in late summer. I was chopping onions while she handled the more complex task of creating a sauce that somehow transformed ordinary ingredients into something approaching art. "My ex-husband called yesterday," she said without preamble, her voice carrying the tone of someone who'd rehearsed this conversation but was still uncertain about having it. "About the wedding?" I asked, remembering her earlier mention of his upcoming remarriage. Indirectly. He wanted to discuss Emma and Jake's inheritance, which seems like an odd topic for someone about to start a new family. But Robert always did have a talent for poorly timed conversations. She stirred the sauce, with perhaps more vigor than necessary, and I sensed there was more to this story than inheritance planning. What did he want to discuss specifically? He's worried that his new wife might feel uncomfortable with the amount of money he's planning to leave the kids. Apparently, she's expressed concerns about fairness, given that she's hoping to have children of her own. I set down my knife and turned to face her fully. "And he wants you to do what, exactly? Reassure his fiancée that your children don't deserve their father's support? He wants me to agree to restructure the kids' trust funds so that any future children he has will receive equal shares, which would effectively cut Emma and Jake's inheritance in half to accommodate children who don't exist yet." The casual cruelty of the request was breathtaking, but Sarah's measured tone suggested this wasn't entirely surprising behavior. "What did you tell him?" "I told him that he was welcome to structure his will however he chose, but that I wouldn't be participating in conversations designed to justify reducing support for the children he actually has in favor of the children he might have." "Good for you." "The thing is," she continued, lowering the heat under the sauce, "this is exactly why I was so careful about rebuilding my life after the divorce. Robert has a pattern of creating chaos and then expecting everyone around him to help manage the consequences. Has he always been like this?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, leaning against the counter with her arms crossed. "You know, for years I told myself that his behavior was just personality quirks that I needed to be more patient with. He was disorganized, so I became hyper-organized. He was impulsive with money, so I became obsessively budget-conscious. He made commitments he couldn't keep, so I learned to never rely on anyone but myself." That sounds exhausting. It was. But I didn't realize how exhausting it was until I stopped doing it. Living alone for the first time in my adult life was revelatory. I could make decisions without having to anticipate how someone else might undermine them. I could plan a week, a month, a year, without wondering what crisis would require me to abandon my plans. She moved to the stove and began adding pasta to the boiling water, her movements efficient and practiced. That's what I meant when I said I'd learned to be careful. Not careful about taking risks or trying new things, but careful about who I allow to influence the stability I've worked so hard to create. "And now?" I asked gently. "Now I'm trying to figure out whether letting someone matter to me again is worth the risk of that kind of disruption." The honesty of her statement hit me like a physical force. This wasn't just about dating or companionship. Sarah was asking herself whether she was willing to make herself vulnerable to the kind of disappointment that had shaped her previous decade. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "Always." What would I have to do to prove that I'm not Robert? She looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, surprise maybe, or gratitude for the directness of the question. You couldn't prove that, she said finally. No one can prove what they won't do in the future, but you could continue being who you've been so far. Which is? Someone who shows up when you say you will. Someone who listens to what I'm actually saying instead of what you wish I were saying. Someone who has their own life and interests and doesn't need me to manage their emotional well-being. Those seem like pretty basic relationship requirements. You'd be surprised how rare they are. We finished preparing dinner in thoughtful silence, and I found myself processing the weight of what Sarah had shared. Her wariness wasn't personal. It was learned behavior from someone who'd spent years adapting to another person's inconsistency. The challenge wasn't convincing her to trust me. It was demonstrating that trust could coexist with the independence she'd fought to establish. Over dinner, the conversation shifted to lighter topics, but I remained conscious of the deeper currents running beneath our surface interactions. Every small choice, arriving when I said I would, asking about her day without immediately relating it to my own experiences, respecting her space when she seemed to need processing time, felt like an investment in something larger than individual moments. The following Saturday, Sarah suggested we visit her daughter Emma in Portland. The invitation felt significant, a step beyond the careful boundaries of our Seattle-based relationship into the broader landscape of her family connections. Are you sure? I asked when she proposed the trip. Meeting the kids feels like a fairly serious relationship milestone. It is, she acknowledged. But Emma specifically asked to meet you, and I realized I want her to. That probably says something about where my head is regarding us. What did you tell her about me? That I've been seeing someone who makes me laugh and doesn't try to fix my problems without being asked. Apparently that was enough to pique her curiosity. We drove to Portland on a crisp Saturday morning, taking Highway 99 through small towns and farmland, rather than the faster interstate route. Sarah navigated while I drove, and we spent the 3 hours talking about everything from her children's personalities to my relationship with my own parents, who lived in retirement in Arizona and still called every Sunday to check on my post-divorce. Emotional recovery. They mean well, I explained, but they have a hard time believing I'm actually happier now than I was during my marriage. The concept of choosing to be alone rather than settling for the wrong relationship doesn't compute with their generation's approach to commitment. What's their approach? Marriage is work. Work is worth doing. Therefore, marriage is always worth the effort regardless of whether fundamental compatibility exists. And you disagree? I think some work is worth doing, and some work is just elaborate. Procrastination to avoid admitting you've made a mistake. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. Emma asked me once why I stayed married to her father for as long as I did. I told her that I kept thinking that if I just tried harder, communicated better, became more understanding, we could fix what was wrong between us. And she said, "Mom, you can't fix incompatibility through effort. That's like trying to solve a math problem by using better handwriting." I laughed despite myself. Wise kid. Terrifyingly wise. Both of my children have this way of cutting through emotional complexity to reach uncomfortable truths. I'm not sure whether that's a generational thing, or just good parenting accidentally producing people who refuse to accept unnecessary drama. Emma lived in a converted warehouse in Portland's industrial district, sharing the space with 3 roommates and what appeared to be half the houseplants in Oregon. She greeted us at the door wearing work boots, paint-stained jeans, and a flannel shirt that had seen better decades, but her smile was immediate and genuine. "So you're Michael," she said, extending a dirt-covered hand. "I've heard interesting things." "All true, I hope," I replied, shaking her hand without concern for the garden soil. "We'll see," she said with mock seriousness, then hugged her mother with the easy affection of someone who'd never questioned whether they were loved. Emma's living space was a fascinating collision of environmental activism and practical artistry. Solar panels powered a sophisticated hydroponic garden, while handmade furniture created comfortable seating areas throughout the enormous room. The walls displayed a mixture of her own photography and what appeared to be collaborative art projects with local environmental organizations. "Emma's working on an urban reforestation initiative," Sarah explained as we toured the space. "She's part of a team that's converting abandoned lots into community gardens and native plant habitats. The city's been surprisingly cooperative, Emma added. Turns out politicians like projects that make them look environmentally conscious, without requiring major budget commitments. She showed us her photography portfolio, stunning images of Portland's transformation over the past decade, focusing on the intersection between urban development and environmental restoration. Her work had a documentary quality that captured both the beauty and the complexity of a city trying to balance growth with sustainability. These are extraordinary, I said, studying a series of photographs showing the same vacant lot across different seasons as it evolved from concrete wasteland to thriving community space. Thanks. Mom says you work with small businesses. What's your take on the economics of environmental restoration? Can it actually pay for itself, or does it always require subsidy? The question launched us into a 2-hour conversation about sustainable business models, community investment, and the long-term economics of environmental stewardship. Emma listened with the focused attention of someone genuinely interested in learning rather than just waiting for her turn to speak, and I found myself impressed by both her knowledge and her willingness to consider perspectives that challenged her assumptions. You know, she said as we prepared to leave, I was worried that Mom might be settling for companionship instead of holding out for actual connection. And now? Sarah asked. Now I think you might have found someone who's actually worth your time, Emma said, giving me an appraising look, which is high praise from someone who's seen what happens when you compromise your standards. During the drive back to Seattle, Sarah was unusually quiet, staring out the passenger window at the landscape passing by. I let the silence stretch, sensing she was processing something that would emerge when she was ready to share it. Emma likes you, she said finally as we crossed the Columbia River. I like her too. She's remarkable, passionate, intelligent, thoughtful. You should be proud. I am. But that's not what I'm thinking about. What are you thinking about? I'm thinking about how natural it felt, having you meet her. How right it seemed to include you in that part of my life. And I'm realizing that somewhere along the way, I've stopped thinking of you as someone I'm dating, and started thinking of you as someone who's becoming part of my life. The distinction was subtle but significant, and I understood exactly what she meant. Dating implied evaluation, a process of determining compatibility and fit. What Sarah was describing was the shift from assessment to integration, from wondering if something could work to recognizing that it already was working. How does that feel? I asked. Terrifying and wonderful in equal measure, she said with a laugh. Like standing at the edge of something I want, but haven't quite convinced myself I deserve. What would convince you? Time, probably. Evidence that this isn't just the honeymoon phase of mutual fascination, but something that can weather the ordinary difficulties of real life, such as sick days, work stress, family drama, financial pressures, the inevitable moments when we annoy each other for no good reason. The stuff that tests whether people actually like each other when the novelty wears off. We drove the rest of the way home discussing practical questions. How often we wanted to see each other. Whether we were ready to be introduced as a couple, to friends and colleagues, what our expectations were for holidays that were rapidly approaching. These conversations felt simultaneously mundane and momentous. The kind of relationship logistics that marked the transition from casual dating to intentional partnership. That evening, as I sat in my apartment reflecting on the day, I realized that meeting Emma had clarified something important about my feelings for Sarah. This wasn't just attraction or companionship or even romantic love in the abstract sense. This was appreciation for the entire ecosystem of Sarah's life. Her children, her work, her values, her way of moving through the world with both caution and courage. I was falling in love not just with who she was with me, but with who she'd become through decades of learning, growing, and choosing herself even when those choices were difficult. At 48, Sarah had the kind of depth that only comes from living fully, making mistakes, recovering from disappointments, and building something authentic from the accumulated wisdom of experience. 3 days later, she called to tell me that Jake had requested a video chat to meet me virtually before his next visit home. Fair warning, she said. He's going to ask you direct questions about your intentions. Medical school has given him a very no-nonsense approach to gathering information. What kind of questions? Knowing Jake? He'll want to know whether you're looking for someone to take care of you or someone to build a life with. He's very protective of my independence. And what's the difference? Someone looking for care wants their problems solved by another person. Someone looking to build a life wants to solve problems together with another person. That's a wise distinction. That's my son, uncomfortably perceptive about emotional dynamics and completely willing to voice observations that most people would keep to themselves. As I prepared for the video call with Jake, I found myself grateful for Sarah's children and their obvious concern for their mother's well-being. Their protective instincts weren't obstacles to navigate around, but evidence of the kind of relationships Sarah had cultivated. Honest, caring, built on mutual respect and genuine affection. This was what 48 looked like when it was lived. Well, not just individual accomplishment, but the creation of a network of people who cared enough to ask hard questions and expect honest answers. I was being invited not just into Sarah's life, but into a family system that valued authenticity over politeness, substance over surface charm. The invitation felt both privilege and responsibility, and I was determined to prove worthy of both. For a video call with Jake took place on a Wednesday evening in early December. Sarah had set up her laptop in the living room, positioning it so that both of us could be clearly seen on camera. As we waited for Jake to connect from his dorm room in Seattle, I found myself more nervous than I'd been before meeting Emma. He's going to be direct, Sarah warned me one final time. Medical students are trained to ask uncomfortable questions until they get clear answers. When Jake's face appeared on screen, the family resemblance was immediately apparent. He had Sarah's green eyes and thoughtful expression, but his questions came with the precision of someone accustomed to making critical decisions quickly. So, Michael, he said without preamble, what are your intentions with my mother? Sarah rolled her eyes. Jake, you're not a Victorian father interrogating a suitor. Actually, I kind of am, he replied with a grin that softened his intensity. Except instead of asking about your prospects for supporting a family, I want to know whether you understand that Mom doesn't need rescuing. I do understand that, I said. In fact, that's one of the things I admire most about her. She's built a life that works, and she's not looking for someone to fix what isn't broken. Good answer. Follow-up question. What do you bring to her life that makes the complications of a relationship worthwhile? It was exactly the kind of direct challenge Sarah had prepared me for, but it still caught me off guard in its bluntness. Honestly, I think I bring someone who appreciates who she's become rather than trying to change her into someone else. And hopefully, I bring partnership instead of dependency. Someone to share experiences with rather than someone who needs to be taken care of. Jake nodded approvingly. Mom, he's giving better answers than the last guy you dated. There was no last guy I dated, Sarah protested. Exactly my point. Your standards have been appropriately high. The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, ranging from my work to my thoughts on environmental policy to my opinion on the Seattle Mariners' prospects for next season. Jake asked questions with the systematic thoroughness of someone conducting a medical interview, but his underlying warmth was evident throughout. Final question, he said as we prepared to end the call. Are you planning to propose to my mother? Jake, Sarah exclaimed, but I could see she was curious about my answer. I don't know, I said honestly. We haven't talked about marriage specifically, but I can tell you that I can't imagine my life without her in it. And if she's open to that kind of commitment, then yes, I'd very much like to marry her. The admission surprised me with its certainty. I hadn't consciously reached that conclusion, but hearing myself say the words, I realized they were completely true. After we ended the call, Sarah and I sat in unusual silence. The evening had taken an unexpectedly serious turn, and Jake's final question had forced me to articulate feelings I was still processing. I should probably apologize for putting you on the spot like that, Sarah said finally. You didn't put me on the spot. Jake did, and I'm grateful for it. Grateful? It made me realize that I've been thinking about marriage without admitting it to myself, and it gave me the chance to see how you reacted when I said I wanted to marry you. How did I react? Like someone who might want the same thing but isn't quite ready to say so. Sarah smiled. The kind of expression that seemed to illuminate her entire face. You're getting very good at reading me. Is that good or dangerous? Both, probably. The months between December and the following spring passed with the kind of steady deepening that characterizes relationships built on solid foundations. We navigated our first holiday season together, spending Christmas morning at Sarah's house with Emma and Jake, who had both come home for winter break. The domestic ease of that morning, cooking breakfast together, exchanging gifts that reflected real knowledge of each other's interests, Jake's gentle teasing about my obvious nervousness around family traditions, felt like a preview of the kind of life we might build together. I gave Sarah a first edition of A Room of One's Own by Virginia Woolf, something I'd found at a rare bookstore after remembering her mention of how the essay had influenced her thinking about independence and creativity. She gave me a weekend getaway to a cabin in the San Juan Islands, complete with reservations at restaurants she'd researched specifically for their commitment to local, sustainable ingredients. "You pay attention," she said when I expressed amazement at how perfectly her gift matched interests I wasn't sure I'd even articulated. "You inspire attention," I replied. We spent the New Year's weekend at the cabin, hiking through winter landscapes and talking about the year ahead. It was during one of these conversations that Sarah shared something that helped me understand the final piece of her emotional landscape. "I want to tell you about the worst period of my marriage," she said as we walked along a beach covered in smooth stones worn by decades of tide. "You don't have to. I want to. I think you should know what I'm comparing this to. Why I'm so careful about protecting what we have." She told me about the 3 years before her divorce, when Robert's behavior had become increasingly erratic. Financial decisions made without consultation, promises to the children that he couldn't keep, long periods of emotional withdrawal followed by intense demands for attention and reassurance. "The hardest part wasn't his behavior," she said. "It was how I changed in response to it. I became hypervigilant, constantly trying to anticipate problems and prevent crises. I stopped trusting my own judgment because I was always second-guessing whether I was being too sensitive or not sensitive enough." That sounds like emotional exhaustion. It was. And the recovery took years. Learning to trust my own perceptions. Again, to believe that my needs were valid. To stop automatically accommodating someone else's dysfunction. "Is that why you were so hesitant about us initially?" "Partly. But also because what we have feels so different from what I had before, that sometimes I don't know how to trust it. You show up when you say you will. You listen without trying to fix everything. You have your own life and your own interests. Sometimes it feels too easy, like I must be missing some crucial flaw." "Maybe the flaw is that I leave my coffee cups in the sink instead of washing them immediately," I suggested. "I've noticed that, actually. It's oddly reassuring to know you have at least one imperfection, just one, that I've discovered so far." By spring, we had settled into rhythms that felt both comfortable and energizing. Sarah had started including me in her volunteer work at the animal shelter, where I discovered an unexpected talent for socializing anxious dogs. I had begun helping her with the more technical aspects of her garden planning, using spreadsheet skills from my consulting work to track planting schedules and yield calculations. These shared activities weren't just ways to spend time together. They were explorations of how our different strengths complemented each other, how we could collaborate without either person disappearing into the partnership. The proposal, when it finally came, wasn't dramatic or elaborate. It happened on a Tuesday morning in our coffee shop, almost exactly 1 year after Sarah had first asked me if 48 was too old. We were sitting at the same table where we'd had that pivotal conversation, discussing weekend plans and the progress of Sarah's spring garden. The familiarity of the setting suddenly struck me as perfect. This was where our story had really begun, where we'd first moved beyond polite conversation to genuine connection. "Sarah," I said, interrupting her description of the new raised beds she was planning for her vegetable garden. "Yes?" "I've been thinking about what Jake asked me back in December, about whether I was planning to propose to you. Have you reached a conclusion?" "I have. And I realize I should probably do this properly, with a ring and a speech and some kind of romantic gesture. Should you?" "Probably. But this feels right. Here. Where we learn to be honest with each other. Where you asked me the question that changed everything." I reached across the table and took her hands in mine. "I love you, Sarah. I love your intelligence, your independence, your terrible jokes about municipal zoning regulations. I love the way you've built a life that reflects your values, and I love that you've made space in that life for me. Michael. I know we're not kids. I know marriage at our age means different things than it meant when we were 25. But I want to build the rest of my life with you. I want to be the person you come home to, the person you travel with, the person you figure out retirement with. I want to be your partner in the fullest sense of the word. Are you asking me to marry you? I'm asking if you think 48 is too old to start the best chapter of our lives together. Sarah's smile was radiant, transforming her entire face in the way that still made my heart skip beats, even after a year of seeing it regularly. No, she said. 48 is exactly the right age to know what we want and be brave enough to go after it. Is that a yes? That's a yes. The coffee shop around us continued its normal rhythm. Baristas preparing orders, customers typing on laptops, the familiar sounds of ordinary life proceeding as usual. But for us, everything had changed again. Just as it had a year earlier when Sarah had dared to ask a question that seemed impossible to answer. 6 months later, we were married in Sarah's backyard, surrounded by friends, family, and approximately 300 blooming plants that served as the most beautiful wedding decorations either of us could have imagined. Emma officiated the ceremony, having gotten ordained online specifically for the occasion. Jake served as both best man and maid of honor, claiming that traditional gender roles were less important than his desire to make sure both of his new parents were properly supported. My own parents flew in from Arizona, initially bewildered by my decision to remarry at 47, but completely charmed by Sarah's combination of warmth and intelligence. Sarah's mother traveled from the countryside where she'd been living since Sarah's father's death, bringing homemade wine and stories about Sarah's childhood that revealed the roots of her daughter's careful attention to building beautiful, sustainable things. The ceremony itself was brief, focused on the promises we were making rather than elaborate ritual. We wrote our own vows, speaking directly to each other about partnership, respect, and the courage required to remain vulnerable even when it would be easier to retreat into individual self-protection. I promise to love you without trying to change you, Sarah said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. I promise to build our life together without losing myself in the process. And I promise to keep asking the hard questions, because that's how we got here. I promise to show up, I replied. Not just physically, but emotionally, intellectually, spiritually. I promise to be curious about your thoughts, supportive of your dreams, and honest about my own needs. And I promise that if you ever ask me, again whether you're too old for something that matters, my answer will always be no. As we exchanged rings, I thought about the journey that had brought us to this moment. A year and a half earlier, I had been a divorced man learning to live alone, convinced that the most passionate chapters of my life were behind me. Sarah had been a woman who'd built careful walls around her heart, protecting the independence she'd fought so hard to establish. Now we were two people who'd discovered that the right partnership doesn't require the sacrifice of individual identity, but rather the expansion of what's possible when two complete people choose to build something together. The reception lasted until well past midnight, filled with dancing, storytelling, and the kind of relaxed celebration that happens when people gather to honor something that feels both joyful and inevitable. Emma and Jake gave a joint toast that managed to be both hilarious and moving, acknowledging their initial skepticism about their mother's dating life, but their complete approval of the choice she'd ultimately made. As Sarah and I prepared to leave for our honeymoon, 2 weeks in Italy, visiting gardens and vineyards in small towns where we could practice being married without the daily demands of our regular lives, I reflected on the unexpected gift of finding love at an age when I'd assumed romance was a young person's endeavor. So, Sarah said as we walked to our car, her wedding dress traded for comfortable travel clothes, but her radiance unchanged. Any regrets about marrying someone who's pushing 50? Only one, I said. What's that? That we didn't meet when we were ready for each other sooner. But we wouldn't have been ready sooner, she pointed out. We needed all those years of learning who we were separately before we could figure out who we might be together. She was right, of course. At 25 or 35, we would have been different people with different needs, different fears, different ideas about what love should look like. The relationship we'd built was only possible because we'd both done the work of becoming ourselves first. Flawed, complex, fully formed adults who could choose partnership as an enhancement rather than a necessity. As we drove away from the Reception. I thought about the question that had started everything. I'm 48. Is that too old? The answer, I now knew with complete certainty, was that 48 wasn't too old for anything that mattered. It wasn't too old for new love, for taking risks, for building a life that honored both individual growth and shared dreams. If anything, 48 was exactly the right age to know the difference between settling and choosing, between needing someone and wanting them, between the kind of love that diminishes you and the kind that makes you more yourself than you ever imagined. Possible. We were just getting started. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.